Welcome back to Establish the Edge. And now that we're a couple weeks removed from the combine and sorting through players' athletic testing, I know I can then expect JJ Zacharyason's late round prospect guide from lateround.com to be waiting in my inbox. And I want to start there, JJ, because everyone listening to a March podcast on prospect profiles is not only doing so from their parents' basement, without a doubt, but I think they want the details. They're that kind of individual. So let's begin with an overview of your model, since your writing and prospect scores in the guide are done with the goal of helping every reader win at fantasy football.
Yeah, so from my parents' basement to yours, I have a few models. One's a wide receiver one, one's a running back one. I have a tight end one as well. Obviously, all of those have different inputs in them because wide receivers are going to do different things than running backs are. But I would say at a high level, what the models are trying to do is project and predict what I call B2S, which is best two seasons across a player's first 3 years in the league. So, the analogy I used in the guide was like, we have to measure against something, because if you don't measure against something, what's the, like, how do you know that you're any better than draft capital itself, right? Like if you're filling out a March Madness bracket and you know that in history, the 1 seeds always won, right? Final fours were always just 1 seeds, appropriate for March, of course. And, what would be the reason to ever do analysis on which teams would be over and undervalued if you know that the better seeds are always going to win? There wouldn't be any reason, right? And it's similar to prospecting with the NFL draft, is that if draft capital were perfect, if the RB1 or the wide receiver one was the best wide receiver, was the best running back, we would not need any sort of modeling or any sort of analysis to help us rank these players for fantasy purposes, because we could just look at the NFL draft and say, oh, that's how we should be drafting. But I use best two seasons to look and make sure that the model itself is projecting that output better than the actual NFL draft is, better than rookie draft ADP is, right? And so I'm looking at all these different inputs. Like at running back, I look at things like breakout score, which is actually the running back model this year. I'm not using any rushing metrics, which is potentially a conversation, maybe not, but I use this metric called breakout score for both running back and a wide receiver, and it's based on age-adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt numbers, and it's also adjusted for strength of opponent. And then at running back, I'm using best season reception share. You have a size input, you have draft capital, of course, as an input, and you have age as an input as well. I think that's all, and speed score is another one at running back. And then at wide receiver, I'm looking at breakout score. It's gets a little bit more signal at wide receiver. I'm looking at rushing production at wideout, some size inputs, draft capital, and early declare status as well. So there's just a bunch of different inputs that I'm looking at. But the goal of it at the end of the day is to project how well a player is going to do across his first 3 years in the league based on that B2S, the best 2 seasons. And I think the best way to sort of describe what these models do is that they allow you to see when to deviate from draft capital, right? So draft capital is an important input in these models, and people will say that's cheating. Well, I'm saying I don't care. I'm trying to win in fantasy football, right? Like this is a major important input that teams are spending millions of dollars on. I'm not just going to ignore where these guys get drafted. And also our rookie drafts are happening generally after the draft. And also, even if they're coming before the draft, you can use projected draft capital through like NFL mock draft database. So, but it's really the ZAP model at the end of the day is telling you when you should deviate from draft capital when you are drafting in your rookie drafts or when you're drafting even in redraft leagues.
And the ZAP model, when people scroll down in the prospect guide to the wide receivers, does get spicy at the very top. Let's start there, because initially when draft betting was released, it was Tet McMillan who was favored to go as the first wide receiver in the actual NFL draft on night 1. But since the combine, instead, Matthew Golden flipped the board with his fastest 40 at his position. Having said that, it's not those two who are in your top tier for wide receivers alone. It's also Luther Burden who stands neck and neck with them. So your thoughts on Burden's profile for fantasy?
Yeah, I think that Burden is pretty polarizing for good reason. I would say, and I would argue that of any wide receiver in this draft class, he has the best single season compared to anyone. His sophomore year was unbelievable. Especially when you consider that it was his sophomore season where he did what he did. Really high yards per team pass attempt rate that led to a 96.3 breakout score, which is the best in this year's class. And the problem with his overall profile though is that his junior season he saw a dip in production after having that really awesome sophomore season, and also his deployment. I mean, he was used largely as a slot player. Largely, he saw a lot of manufactured touches, which is not always what you want to see. The thing that I have trouble with though, and I actually rank Tet ahead of Luther Burden right now in my rankings, mostly because of this highly volatile profile that he has. It really depends on, I want to see where he ends up actually going, in the draft before I would say, oh, I'm definitely going to take Burden over a guy like McMillan. But, with Burden, I think that people sort of say, oh, there's no way this guy can work out in the NFL because other players who have had a similar profile, like a Wan'Dale Robinson, where it's like a low A dot, kind of does everything on the field from a yak perspective, isn't necessarily getting down the field that much. Rondell Moore, similar, good age adjusted production, but how does that really translate to the next level? I don't think that's necessarily the right way we should be looking at this. I think that we should recognize that that's sort of like the lower outcome for Burden here. But those guys also didn't have potential first round draft capital. I know that Wan'Dale Robinson was a reach and Rondell Moore, had second round draft capital, but Burden's looking like he's probably gonna be a late first, early second rounder at this point. So that's good news for him, but also he's bigger than those guys. And if you look at what's going on in the NFL right now, there's a certain archetype that I think he fits under pretty well. Like his top comp in the model was DJ Moore. Now Moore played a lot more perimeter, in college. And I would say that DJ Moore was the better prospect overall, from a production standpoint and just kind of how he would translate to the NFL. Very similar build though, that yak profile's there. Maybe not the crispest route runner in the world, but definitely can do a lot with the ball in his hands. And then another comp in the model was Brandon Ayuk, who had a lot of like man on man questions, entering the league. Is he going to be able to beat man? Is he going to be a crisp route runner? And I think that's the archetype that we're working with here is these guys who are very good after the catch, very good with the ball in their hands. Can we get the ball in their hands? Right. And so with Burden, if you want to think of it like, I don't see it necessarily as like, oh, we got to avoid him no matter what. I see all of these quote unquote red flags, the low A dot, the high slot usage. Is he going to have that high of a ceiling because he can only play in the slot? And is his draft capital going to be there? And, we didn't see him. He saw a lot of manufactured touches. He had one of the highest rates of career targets behind the line of scrimmage in this year's class. I don't see it as like the biggest red flag in the world. I just see it as there's a wider range of outcomes for him because I do think on the higher end here, Daigle, is the archetype of Malik Neighbors, Jamar Chase. Like that's all part of, if you look at DJ Moore and his style and the way he plays, and his body type, like he's not as good as Malik Neighbors and Jamar Chase because they can just do more from like a route tree perspective and they're better route runners than him. But what if it does translate for Luther Burden? Like I see a scenario where he's like a diet Malik Neighbors. Like he's not as good. I don't think that, Malik Neighbors was a 99.5 out of 100 from a scoring perspective in the ZAP model. Luther Burden is 96.5 right now. So he's not as good as Malik Neighbors, but I do think that that's the archetype that we're working with here. And some NFL team might like that and might know how to deploy that kind of player. So I just see a really wide range of outcomes for Luther Burden. The model loves him. The model likes him more than I do because it's not necessarily recognizing, the lower end and the fact that he saw the low A dots and the stuff behind the line of scrimmage and such.
In that case, what is the archetype for Tet McMillan, and does his draft capital, is that why you have him ranked slightly ahead of Burden despite being in the same tier? Because if we did this 10 out of 10 times, I think we would both say Tet's probably the one who's still drafted ahead of Burden 9 out of 10 at least.
Yeah, look, so Tet's different because he's a perimeter guy. He can play all over the formation, but he can at least be a perimeter guy. We know that he can be sort of that like standard X alpha on a team. And he also, Burden, like I said, he had that bad junior season or saw a big decrease in production as a junior. McMillan had two really productive seasons his sophomore and junior year at Arizona. Now, the issue that I have with Tet is the way that some look at him like a Drake London type, That's probably his most common comp that's out there. The difference to me analytically is that Drake London had a really, really good age-adjusted profile, production profile, like one of the best that we've seen over the last 15 years. And so, his breakout score, Drake London's, which again is based on receiving yards per team pass attempt, that's adjusted for age and strength of schedule. And Drake London's was like 98, 99, his breakout score. Tet McMillan's is like 83. And if you look at first round wide receivers since 2011, that's like a 27th percentile breakout score for Tet McMillan, which scares me a little bit. I mean, when you look at players who had breakout scores in the first round since 2011 through 2022, so I'm going to give players 3 years to be eligible to play in the NFL. There's been 22 of them who had breakout scores below 90, and of those 22, only one of them scored 14 or more PPR points per game in their first 3 years. And so Tet McMillan is part of that group, right? Like that's a little bit scary. That's only a 4.5% rate. Whereas if you look at the players who were above a 90 breakout score, again, Tet McMillan's at 83. The players who were above that 80 or that 90 breakout score that were drafted in round one, their rate of getting to 14 or more PPR points per game, it goes from 4.5% to 18%. So you get a lot higher probability of hitting if you're above that mark and breakout score, which he didn't get to. So I don't think he's like a bad prospect whatsoever. He has a score of 96.1 in the ZAP model. Luther Burden's at 96.5. They're very, very close. But I do think that there are some question marks, which is why the model spit out comps of T. Higgins and Cortland Sutton and not quite like the Drake London comps of, him being, that elite of a prospect, even though he might go in a similar range from a draft capital perspective.
For Matthew Golden, as I mentioned earlier, his testing, although he was logically viewed as a terrific prospect, his testing only increased his market in terms of NFL draft and what we believe will be his now very high draft capital on night one. Does your model say that as well, or is it down compared to what we believe NFL is viewing him as?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concerns with Matthew Golden's profile. Now, I will say, if you look at his raw best season receiving yards per team pass attempts, it's below 2. And anytime you're below 2, it's really bad news. I mean, we haven't seen many hits whatsoever out of that kind of grouping in the last 15 years. You get like the Tyreek Hills of the world, Hunter Renfrow always pops up, Terry McLaurin, but these are guys that like they're outliers. Like we've gone on shows in the past and we've said, oh, that's an outlier profile, right? And then Ladd McConkey also was there, which is actually Matthew Golden's top comp for me, but his other two comps are Roman Wilson and Curtis Samuel, so it's a little bit rough. But, Ladd McConkey, the difference between McConkey and Matthew Golden analytically was that McConkey had a crazy good yards per route run profile. He just wasn't used enough at Georgia, and that's why his receiving yards per team pass attempt number was low like Golden's. Now, to be fair, when you adjust that number, that receiving yards per team pass attempt number for strength of schedule, you get, it looks a little bit more favorable. So Matthew Golden doesn't look as bad as that raw number because Texas, obviously last year in particular, played a tough schedule, had a good team, all that good stuff. But I will say we've had 22 first or second round wide receivers drafted between 2011 and 2022 with breakout scores below 60. Of those 22, only 4 of them gave fantasy managers a 14 or more PPR point per game season in year 1, 2, or 3. So Matthew Golden's part of that group. He's under that 60 mark, well below that 60 mark and breakout score. Generally, I'm fearful of the players that rise in draft capital, projected draft capital, or just draft capital in general. I mean, we don't know where teams had him pre-combine, obviously, but he definitely was not being mocked in the first round very frequently pre-combine. And now you get, like Jeremiah putting him up there and as his wide receiver 1, and guys who are like legit connected to the NFL putting him as wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 in this class, which tells me he's going to go in round 1. Like, I think that that's happening at this point, and that's happening based on what he did in his 40. And that scares me because there's not that much correlation at wide receiver between, there's really none that I've tested between running a good 40, especially when you have draft capital like layered on top. I mean, like, the argument would be that we care about 40 times at wide receiver because it can improve a player's draft capital. And we know that draft capital does get signal. But if you start to, if you test that and sort of normalize it a little bit, you notice that teams are reaching when players do this and have these like are crazy athletic and have these like crazy combines when the production profile is not there. A good example was last year with like Adonai Mitchell. People were obsessed with Mitchell. He has a good combine because he's a freak athlete. And, he goes in round 2, pretty early round 2. And he wasn't, from a production profile standpoint, he had one of the worst yards per route run rates that we've seen in the last decade. So like it's or at least for that draft capital. So I am concerned about Matthew Golden. I can see the potential. That's why, I think it's good that the model spit out Ladd McConkey as a comp, because we know there's at least something there, but I don't want to really bet on that consistently. Like the other thing too, and this is more of like a dynasty take, but like if you line up the wide receivers in this class and you start to rank them, the class isn't very strong. So it's pretty easy to still have Matthew Golden in your top 5, So like, I'm still going to have him as a top 5 wide receiver in the class. And I'm probably going to have him around market because of that. Like it's relatively chalky at the top. And so it's very easy to just kind of slip him in, because if he's going to be a first round wide receiver, we can't ignore that. But I do have massive concerns about his production profile overall.
I'm glad you mentioned the dynasty view of it too, because I don't want to give everything away, but right now a hot button player is Travis Hunter. And so let's start with the dynasty angle of that, because he is in your 6th tier, for example, at the back end of the first round of any rookie drafts. And so what does the production profile say for such an odd player, just someone we haven't had to analyze like this coming out?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because so analytically, let me take a step back. I go and I talk to Matt Harmon, right? Who charts these wide receivers with reception perception, does an awesome job with it. Harmon comes up to me and he texts me and he's like, Travis Hunter is one of the best prospects that I've ever charted before. And I'm like, oh man, and this is before I really like looked at him in the prospect model and was like digging into his numbers and stuff. So I'm getting pretty amped because at this time he was going to the combine as a cornerback and I had no plan on analyzing him as a wide receiver, right? Because if he was going to go as a corner, then I'm not going to put him in the model. But then it changed and they said that he was going to go as a corner and a wide receiver. So I'm like, okay, I got to dig into this profile. So I go and I dig into the profile and I was pretty underwhelmed. He had a top season receiving yards per team pass attempt of 2.61, which is a 20th percentile number among all first round wide receivers since 2011. His breakout score is 67. That's a 15th percentile number compared to first rounders over the last, 13, 14 years or what have you. So his numbers are underwhelming. Like if you look at, you can look at his raw totals and be like, oh, he won the Heisman last year, but Colorado threw the ball a lot. And so when you give it that context, the numbers that we know are predictive from college to the NFL, receiving yards per team pass attempt, yards per route run, stuff like that, he doesn't look that good. Like he doesn't look horrible, but he's not like some obvious slam dunk prospect like we've seen, last year with Malik Neighbors, right? Where Malik Neighbors numbers were like unbelievably good. And so I've kind of taken a step back. I'm like, okay, I gotta understand how to analyze this. And I think that the way we have to look at it from like a dynasty perspective or even a redraft perspective, is that people are going to look at it as the Travis Hunter, the talent. There's that evaluation. But I think that might not even matter that much because the bigger evaluation is how is this team going to freaking deploy him? Like we don't know how much offense he's even going to play. And so, you mentioned that in my rankings, I have Travis Hunter as like a late first rounder in Superflex rookie drafts right now. His ADP is actually early second round. So despite the fact that I have questions about him as a talent, which I can get to in a second and dive a little bit deeper into that, despite the questions that I have about how the model views him, how his analytics look versus what consensus says, I think that the bigger driving force here is going to be how much do you think he's going to play? And, how do you view that in terms of him just producing in fantasy football, right? And so to me, I like to play for ceiling. And if Travis Hunter gets drafted to, I think that we can be reactive based on where he goes and what his coaches are saying. But if he goes to a team where they say, yeah, he's going to play in high leverage situations and, he's going to run a route on a lot on X percent of dropbacks or what have you. They're not going to be that accurate and that specific, but like he's probably not going to run route or be on the field on like clear running plays. Okay. But that doesn't really matter from the standpoint of fantasy, right? I think what we could see is that he runs a route on maybe 60 to 80% of the team's dropbacks. And that could still be beneficial in fantasy. And then what if they realize, oh, he's bad at corner in the NFL, but he's really good at wide receiver. then all of a sudden you do have a decent wide receiver, a very good wide receiver prospect that you got at the end of the first round, where there's going to be a lot of question marks anyways. So, and again, going back to the talent evaluation side, the analytics are scary for sure, but you can explain some of that away because the dude was playing like 90 snaps a game, on both sides. He's not going to every wide receiver meeting and getting normal reps at wide receiver. And so I do think that because of that, you could see a scenario where he looks really good. And if you watch him, the dude is just clean, man. I mean, like he is a very good wide receiver and he moves really well. And so like I could see a scenario where he just wasn't prepped the same way. And so he looks good from a film perspective, but analytically his production might not totally be there because he's not always on the same page with like Shedeur Sanders, or he's not always like the go-to target in the offense, just based on the fact that he wasn't getting all of the reps that other wide receivers would.
Because of that talent you mentioned when stepping back and viewing it, do you then consider him a value in the 10th round for the sickos drafting an underdog right now? Because we tossed it around on the last episode and did not come to a conclusion whatsoever. Amico wanted to be over ADP. Herzig wanted to be well under. Leone and I were about ADP, but if I push him up a tier of wide receiver into the 9th round, he'd be going around Michael Pittman right now, Xavier Leggett, and I feel comfortable taking his ceiling outcome over those guys.
Yeah, I think I would too. It would just depend on your specific decision. But I think that it makes sense to be probably a little bit more bullish than where he's going right now, because like I said, when people say that a player is not going to play every snap on offense at wide receiver in particular, that doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is how many snaps he's playing when there's a drop back situation, right? And so there's going to be situations, he's going to miss some first downs probably where they run a play action or something and he's not on the field and he's not going to, but like whatever team drafts him, there's a chance that, let's say the top wide receiver on that team sees a 90% route rate or route participation. There's a chance that he's at like 70%. And if you're getting 70% route participation rates from a guy like Travis Hunter, especially in a best ball format, that could be pretty beneficial. So I think that I hate to use the cop out, but he's probably a better in best ball kind of player too.
And more so than route participation, I feel like we'll be discussing his target per route run rate a lot at the beginning of the year, because the intent, if he's on the field, I would imagine, is to get him the ball, right? Not just to have him out there running regular.
Yeah, sorry. And a team might force it more than usual. Exactly. Like they're like, we got to use this dude because we just spent this capital on him and he's good. And I agree with that totally.
Once we got those results from the combine and the testing, was there a player that let you down? Someone you were initially higher on, but then you plugged in the numbers and the model said otherwise?
Yeah. So a wide receiver, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So the ZAP model doesn't use any metrics at wide receiver for the combine. So none of the measurables, right? I do care about like height and weight, but 40 time, I don't care, because that's going to generally be reflected in draft capital. So if a dude runs a fast 40, Matthew Golden doing what he did, it's probably good, but it's not directly good, if that makes sense, because draft capital is an input. So obviously it'll help there. The one player that, I wasn't really high on him. I actually was lower than consensus on him before the combine, but now I'm almost entirely out, is Tez Johnson. So, he weighs in at 154 pounds. The ZAP model goes back to 2011. That's the second lightest wide receiver in the model's history, in the database history, ahead of only Tutu Atwell. And look, we've seen players that have been smaller of late do okay in fantasy football. You've got Xavier Worthy had a good end of the season. Devontae Smith obviously has been good. We had Elijah Moore have, a decent rookie season. But at the same time, we generally don't see massive ceilings from these smaller players. So if you look at, again, going back to 2011 in the ZAP model database, there have been 14 wide receivers who weighed under 170 pounds at the NFL Combine. So Johnson weighed in 154 pounds, so he's well below this weight. Of those 14, you had Hollywood Brown, Tank Dell, Devontae Smith, and Xavier Worthy hit double-digit PPR points per game in one of their first 3 seasons, okay? Obviously, they had draft capital backing them a little bit. Tank Dell's still a day 2 pick. You got some 3 first-rounders outside of that. Tez Johnson is not going to be a first round pick. He's probably at this point, he might not, but he probably won't even be a day 2 pick. So you have lower odds based on that. But on top of that, those 4 wide receivers had really good production profiles in college. And they also, despite their size, played a lot of inside out. And I should say at the combine, Tez Johnson also ran like a 4.51 at that weight, which is really bad at that size. Right. And so I think he had really good like agility numbers. And so that just points to him being a good slot guy. But to me, that's part of the problem because the smaller guys that we've seen thrive, Jordan Addison's another example of this. The smaller guys that we've seen thrive in the NFL have been able to play both inside out. They're not only slot guys. And I also fear, honestly, a guy who's 154 pounds playing the slot and just getting destroyed. Like it just that's part of this like more subjective evaluation of Tez Johnson too. So I was lower on him entering the combine, and after the combine, I am pretty much just out on Tez Johnson.
And his ADP on Underdog reflects that because he's dropped three full rounds.
Yeah.
He's basically going undrafted at times now in early best ball. What about the Bizarro Tez Johnson, the opposite spectrum of someone who now you seem to be higher on post testing?
Yeah, again, a guy that I liked going into the combine and then he crushed the combine was Jalen Knoll out of Iowa State. He just kind of did everything right. In terms of production, like was like above average everywhere. If you're looking at like breakout score, it ranked in the 76th percentile among players in this class. His top year in receiving yards per team pass attempt was 61st. His career yards per route run, 58th percentile. So like he was above average across the class in pretty much every statistical category that I care about. But then also, you know, the ZAP model does look at rushing production for wide receivers because it signals that these guys are talented because they're getting the ball in a lot of different ways. So there is some signal with rushing production, but there's also more like subjective signal with like special teams play. So Jalen Knoll played special teams. He played all over the field. He was mostly slot, but he can play a little perimeter. You know, he got down the field. He had 1 year with like a really low ADOT. He had, even last year, he had more deep ball targets, raw targets than Jaden Higgins on the same team. And Jaden Higgins is the big X perimeter who can run a 4.47, and Jalen Knoll is out there seeing just as many deep ball targets as him. There's just a lot to like about this profile. His top comp in the model was Randall Cobb, which is obviously intriguing because, you know, a really good guy who could play out of the slot, can play kind of everywhere. But can also do a lot of stuff close to the line of scrimmage. And
the Randall Cobb that hopefully everyone remembers.
Yes.
Not the last couple of years.
Not late career Randall Cobb.
Yeah.
But then there's also, you know, he also gets like Sky Moore, Devin Duvernay. So it's not like perfect because he's not we're not talking about a first round wide receiver here. But regardless, like I think there's a lot to like about Jalen Knoll. If you want like the crazy high ceiling, insane comp, think about his game as like an Amon-Ra St. Brown, where it's like a 50-50 inside out. Like he can play the slot really, really well as like his base, but what if he does grow and they do allow, whatever team drafts him allows him to play a little bit on the outside? Like to me, Jalen Knoll is probably my favorite value at the wide receiver position in this class.
Moving on to running back, you mentioned at the top that you remove, what was it, rushing production from your inputs?
Yeah, we can talk about this.
Yeah, please do, because that seems, I almost thought I said it wrong there, but no, yeah, you mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, I could riff about like what goes into the ZAP model, which I did at the beginning of the show forever.
And at the beginning of the guide, you also go into depth about it too.
Yeah, I try to be transparent about it because it's important. Because like I think that's sort of the difference between doing this like so analytical and analytically versus doing more film based, is that a lot of the film, not no shade to like anyone who scouts the typical way. But the difference is that like we're trying to solve fantasy football, which is a numbers based game. So it's really a lot easier to kind of match that way with numbers. Right. But then also you can very easily go back and see like, oh, is this working? Is this not working? Because it's all math based. So I can just be totally transparent with what this is looking at. But let me take a step back. The metric that I created last year that went into both the running back and wide receiver model was breakout score. And with breakout score at running back, I was using total yards per team play. Okay. So a player would get some total yards per team play rate in a season. It was prorated for games played because they could miss some games that could alter that total, obviously. And so total yards means rushing and receiving per team play, the how many plays the team ran, right? And so that got signal whenever I adjusted for both age and strength of schedule and program, basically. And so, if a player played at a small program, he would get dinged. If he played for Alabama or a program that had a good strength of schedule, he would get a little bit of a boost. And then if he did that, got that production at a young age, that was also a good thing, right? So every year, like, I only have so much time to test different metrics and to come up with different ideas. And this year I was like, you know what? What if I did breakout score for running back the same way that I do it at wide receiver, which is receiving yards per team pass attempt? And so I did that at running back, and I got more signal than I had with total yards per team play. And I tell that to people. I've gotten already, because I've been doing shows on this now over the last month or so, I've gotten a handful of emails of people like yelling at me, being like, why aren't you using rushing metrics? You're going to miss out on Quinshon Judkins because of this. And which the model doesn't even hate Judkins, so I don't even know what they're talking about. But the reason for this, I think, is because other factors that are going into the running back model are capturing rushing enough. Not only that, but rushing is generally more replaceable at the NFL level at running back than receiving is. And then on top of that, we are measuring against PPR output, and we know that receiving matters. Like, what this is really telling you, going back to the thesis and the idea of the ZAP model, we're trying to find when we should deviate from draft capital. Okay. And what I've found is that NFL teams are not valuing receiving the same way that fantasy managers should, right? Like, we care more about stupid dump offs, right? Because of PPR formats and half PPR formats than an NFL team does. It's just, that's facts. Like, teams aren't looking at it the same way. So what does that mean? It means that we need to account for that within our evaluation, because NFL teams are not accounting for it the same way that we are. And so other factors, draft capital, running back size, like, those things are likely capturing the rushing production of these players, whereas the receiving component is just not being captured enough. And then, of course, going back to what I said about the complaints about this, is that people then think that, like, Quinshon Judkins is all of a sudden, or Caleb Johnson is all of a sudden hated by the model. That's not true, because Judkins has a good size profile. He ran a good 40. And also, if you even just look at history and a player with Judkins' receiving numbers, for instance, like, he had a best season reception share of 8.6%. Okay. That was, he got that during his second year at Mississippi. He ran about 100 fewer routes than Travion Henderson did this last season. But they did have, they had a similar yards per route run rate. But regardless, because of what he did from a receiving yards per team pass attempt standpoint, he had a breakout score of 46.5, which is below average. That's not great. I don't think that he's incapable of being a good receiver in the NFL, but I do, like, when you look at history and you look at players with reception shares that are below, best season reception shares that are below 10% and breakout scores that are below 60, those players generally don't see a lot of receiving work in the NFL. Only 2 of them in the ZAP model history have gotten over a 10% target share in one of their first 3 seasons in the league. One of them was Jerick McKinnon, who isn't even a normal running back prospect. The other one was Doug Martin. So, like, you can make these, like, and make these comments and say these things about players like Judkins, or even like Caleb Johnson's numbers look fine because Iowa just didn't throw the ball at all. He actually had a fine enough receiving profile his final season. But Judkins is really interesting because, his numbers weren't that great, but I also don't think anyone should be projecting him to be a 15% target share running back in the NFL either, and there is a teammate score factor in the model as well. So he is getting boosted a little bit because he played with Travion Henderson. But overall, that's the backbone and the reason why rushing production just isn't in the model anymore for running backs. It kind of breaks people's brains a little bit, but that's the logic behind as to why.
One, you were right. Mom's basement's everywhere. We're not ready for input talk. And 2, my only issue, so since you won't push back, I will. My only issue with the old school way of prospect and film analysis is that no one has ever watched the film without telling us they watched the film. One time, I want someone, like Devontae Adams said, to go run your routes and not put it on Instagram. One time, I want someone to do the work without telling me they did the work. But based on all of that rushing production talk you just said and taking it out, does Ashton Jeanty then still become the 101 clear cut in Dynasty for you?
Yeah, easily.
Okay.
Jeanty, so people look at his last season, but his year before that, he had a great reception share. It was like 23%, which is absurd. So if you think about best season reception share, anything over 10% is okay. It's like solid. When you get to like 13 to 15%, that's getting pretty good. Over 15% is really good. If you get over 20% in best season reception share, it's pretty rare. Jeanty was at 23% in his best season. His breakout score, again, that's based on age adjusted and program adjusted because, he played at Boise State. But his breakout score in its receiving yards per team pass attempt, his breakout score was 94.3. Only 6 players in the model's database have best season total yards per team play numbers that are above 2.8, and he's one of them. He's at 2.82. I mean, Ashton Jeanty, if there's one negative to Jeanty, it's that it's very difficult to find comps for him because he's 5'8", 211, and likely a first round pick, and he has all these like absurd numbers
and stands up in the backfield like Jason Voorhees.
You just don't see this combination ever, which is why the reason that you're seeing his top, like people's go-to comp for Jeanty oftentimes is like Maurice Jones-Drew. The fact that you have to go 20 years into the past to find a comp tells you how unique this player is, right? Like in the Zap model, which goes back to 2011, it's Mark Ingram, DeAndre Swift, like those more compact players who had okay enough production. It was not to this degree. Like Jeanty is a special player. He should be in his own tier. Like he's the 101. Yeah.
Is there someone who, as you mentioned, he's in a tier of his own? Is there someone who stands out and a tier or two behind him to you?
Yeah, I think Omarion Hampton is by far the RB2 in this class.
By far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I know that a lot, and your reaction says it too. Like I think there's a lot of like, not even you were saying this, or just a lot of sentiment out there that
it's what ADP represents right now as well.
Right. Exactly. That there's like a group of running backs that would be after Jeanty, whether you're talking Travion Henderson or Quinshon Judkins or Caleb Johnson, obviously Hampton as well. To me, Hampton is an elite prospect. Like if he were in almost any other class, he would easily be the RB1 in that class. It just so happens that he has Ashton Jeanty in his. And if you're talking like going back to the statistical comp conversation, he definitely has cleaner comps than anyone in the class. You got Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, and Rashad Penny were his 3. I know that Rashad Penny obviously didn't pan out, but you're talking about like 2 stud fantasy assets in Gurley and Zeke. And that's because Omarion Hampton is 6 foot, 221. He ran a 4.4640. He has an unbelievable speed score of like 110 or 110 plus. He had a best season reception share of almost 18%. That was 3rd best in the class. That's 3rd best in an elite class. He had a prorated total yards per team play rate that was also 3rd best among combine invites. And again, he did that at 221 pounds, which is the perfect kind of size that you want for a true bell cow in the NFL. And he's also unique though. Like if you look at guys, and I won't give you all the parameters that I used here, but like high speed score players that are over 215 pounds who had reception shares above 15% in the prospect model, you're looking at like just David Johnson and Todd Gurley. Like that, like Omarion Hampton just checks every box that you could possibly want out of a fantasy back. So I think that he is above the other guys. He's in his own tier after Jeanty. And I think right now in rookie drafts, he should be the 102.
What about at the other end of that conversation? Was there a player that lost value in the model post-combine?
Yeah, so, at or with running back and with the running back Zap model, you do get inputs from the combine aside from just size. I do care about speed score. Most running backs in the model will have will just be neutral when it comes to speed score. They won't gain or lose any points, but some players will lose. But then on top of that, I think this year what we saw was some players might have just lost in the draft capital game because the other players in the class did so well. A good example of that to me is Caleb Johnson, where he didn't have a bad speed score with like a low 4.5 40 at his size, right? But he didn't do anything to like push his stock up. Like he didn't go out and run a sub 4.5 at his size where people then would walk away and be like, wow, like he should be in the Omarion Hampton conversation because his production's really good. And, he had this really crazy speed score. and he moved really well. So I think because there were so many other running backs who went to the combine and ran really well for their size, DJ Giddens, as an example, another guy that I'll talk about in a second, Bhayshul Tuten. I think that that hurts a guy just naturally, just based on competition, like Caleb Johnson. And same goes for someone who didn't test, which is Cam Scadaboo. He looks decent from a production standpoint, but when I find data that supports a narrative that is not good, then that is also not good. And what I mean by that is Cam Scadaboo's biggest question mark was his long speed, his explosiveness, right? His career explosive run rate was the worst in this class among all combine invites. And then he goes out and he jumps and shows everybody that he's got a good vertical, and then he can jump really far, but he does not run the 40. And so that only supports at this moment right now, he goes pro day and maybe go nuts, but you also have to adjust pro day numbers. But at this moment, that's not good that he had a bad explosive run rate. You can see it in film that he might not have the long speed, really good between the tackles though, obviously. So that probably at this moment is hurting Scadaboo as well.
You have to remove yourself from his box score since he was an absolute monster that last month of the season.
Yeah.
Fun player. But you already touched on it. I will give you the runway to also speak on Bhayshul Tuten, who came out, I believe, as the most athletic running back among a class that also tested as the most athletic class since the combine even existed.
Yeah, the thing with Tuten too is that I do an episode of the podcast every year on running backs, and then I do one on wide receivers who produce studs in college, right? So it's just a primer to see, okay, which production profiles in this class, which ones look good, which ones look like what we've seen from NFL studs in fantasy football. And so Bhayshul Tuten was one that I actually pointed out as having, this is pre-combine, as having a very, very good and robust production profile from college. Now, he played a little bit at North Carolina A&T, and so he did get a little bit of a boost in reception share, which is not adjusted in the prospect model because there's no signal to adjust it. But when he got to Virginia Tech, he maintained a pretty high reception share. It was still in the 12-13% range. And then all the while, he's got a good build, 5'9", 206, and he goes out and he runs at 4.3, 240, and his speed score was the best in the class. It was over 118. And if you look at the ZAP model database, among running backs who were sub 5'10", 215, right? So smaller running backs who had a speed score above 110 and drafted in the top 200. So basically they were just drafted. You only get Jerick McKinnon, Kenneth Walker, and Jahmyr Gibbs. And now it's Bhayshul Tuten as well, assuming that he goes in the top 200, which I think at this point is pretty much a lock unless something happens, from now until the draft. So Tuten to me, it's going to sound crazy because he's been rising, but I liked him before the combine. And so I'm not shocked that the model saw this, but his top comp in the model is Kenneth Walker. They have a very, very similar size speed profile. Walker's biggest question mark was his reception share from a model perspective. Coming out, it was 7 or 8% in his best season, but his breakout score, this new way that I'm doing breakout score, is actually pretty elite because when he did catch passes, he was gaining a lot of receiving yards. And so Bhayshul Tuten also has a pretty elite receiving yard or a breakout score, and then his reception share better than Walker's, but their size speed is really, really similar. Walker is the more prolific collegiate runner than Tuten was. But I do think that if we see Bhayshul Tuten get better draft capital than expected, tail end round 2 into round 3, that's where that comp is going to matter a little bit more, because the other, Darrington Evans is another comp of his. It's not all just butterflies and rainbows for him. But Darrington Evans, day 2 guy, he went in the 3rd round, but obviously hasn't panned out. But it just goes to show that I do think there is a range here where things can go south, but there is a ceiling, and I usually am going to chase ceiling.
So what you're also saying is that Bhayshul Tuten should not be with Shane Waldron either. Otherwise,
oh my gosh,
he will be screwed. I do want to zoom out before we get out of here at the position and give people some long shots in both formats, best ball and dynasty. Beginning with best ball, because in the last episode, Leone dove into detail about how rookie running backs in rounds 15 through 18, the end, it's 20-round leagues right now in Underdog, that's when we should actually be taking our shots on them before their actual draft capital is known, rather than taking those shots in rounds 10 through 14, since that entire group likely isn't going to get the ball early and put in situations they'll be relied on. And right now at that tail end of the draft range, it is players like Brashad Smith, Jordan James, Woody Marks, Taj Brooks, Jaden Blue, and Jarquez Hunter. Are there any players among that group or other undrafted guy that you are high on?
Yeah, Jarquez Hunter, man. He looks really good in the model for sure. Like if you wanted to move up a tier or two, I'd say DJ Giddens would be one of my go-tos, but that probably fits more of the profile that Leone was talking about, that you don't necessarily want to go like super, super heavy on, but I do think his profile is just underrated in fantasy in general. But Jarquez Hunter, to me, just looks really, really good. He didn't have like a crazy high reception share. Is 10.7% in his best season, which is fine, but it's not like wild. But he had a good breakout score because when he was getting receptions, he was gaining a lot of receiving yards and doing well, and he was doing that at a pretty young age. In fact, when you look at sub 11% reception share players with high breakout scores in the model, the only other guy that pops up is actually Kenneth Walker, who I just talked about. So Hunter looks good from that perspective, but also compared to the rest of the class, he's 9th in career explosive run rate. He was 9th in career yards after contact per attempt. He was 5th in career avoided tackles per rush. Like, he looks pretty good on paper. I don't know if draft capital is really going to follow because he just hasn't gotten that much hype. I haven't seen many people talk about him. And usually if people aren't talking about him, then teams aren't going to be like super, super high in the guy. But he ran a 4.4440 at 204 pounds. I just think there's a lot to like. Like, I think there's a way for him to play sort of a 1B complementary role to start. And then obviously there would be upside with an injury, or he could just be good and just kind of take over and kind of be the guy.
What about in startup or rookie drafts? Is there a player that you find yourself always getting, if only because the rest of the room is not valuing them correctly?
Yeah, I think it's Giddens. Like I was, so the way that I kind of go about this is I write the entire prospect guide. Again, it's 160 pages long. There's 80 prospect profiles in this thing. And then I have the year 2 stuff as well. But I write all of this and then I make rankings based on what I just researched, right? And I don't look at what the consensus is saying from an ADP perspective in rookie drafts or anything like that. And then I compare because I want to see what my research has said and where that compares to what the market is saying. I was kind of shocked that DJ Giddens was ranked where he was. Like I was like 5 to 10 running back spots higher than the market and higher than consensus with Giddens. He ran a 4.4340 at 212 pounds. He spent 3 years at Kansas State. And during the final 2, he caught 50 passes for almost 600 yards. He had a breakout score of 78, best season reception share of 11.2%. A top season and yards per team play, which again, anything over 2 is usually a sign that guy did something good in college. He was over 2. Like, every number in DJ Giddens' profile, including speed score, including the size profile, looks good. And his comps were Cam Akers, Tevin Coleman, and Marlon Mack, which, again, we're talking about a potential day 3 guy, maybe day 2, but those kinds of comps for that kind of player are actually pretty strong, considering all 3 of those guys at least had a moment, in the NFL. So he's probably my go-to. Like, I don't know why more people aren't talking about him. I think it's probably just because the running back class is so loaded. There's so many guys to like, but to me, he really stood out.
I lied. I was going to let you out of here, but then you brought up year 2, and I at least want to stop down for one player because Marvin Harrison Jr. will be one of the most polarizing conversations whenever we get to August and home leagues start happening, just because, as we know, ADP is set still based on reactions at that time. So what does the model say about Marvin Harrison Jr. in year 2?
So yeah, the year 2 model looks at a player's prospect score, looks at his rookie season, some rookie season inputs, and then it spits out a score of how he's going to produce in year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career. Marvin Harrison Jr. is the 4th best wide receiver according to that model in last year's class, behind Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, and Ladd McConkey, which I don't think is like that shocking, but he had like above average marks versus above average marks versus other higher volume rookie wide receivers, over the last decade or so. The other thing I look at too within the year two model is journey comparables, where I look at a player's ZAP score, so his prospect score. I look at his year two score. So this is not stylistic comps, it's not size comps or anything, but I look at players in history who sort of went through that similar journey, right? Who had a similar prospect score entering the league, had a similar year two score, which tells you that their rookie season probably went kind of similarly, as the guy that we're analyzing. And, you get to like, with Ladd McConkey, you're looking at Michael Thomas, T. Higgins, Zay Flowers. With Brian Thomas, you're looking at Justin Jefferson, Odell Beckham, Keenan Allen. Like, they're all like pretty good comps. But then you get to Marvin Harrison and you get Sammy Watkins, Jerry Jeudy, and CD Lamb. So it's like, it's all over the place. Like, it can go. But the thing is that, like, Sammy Watkins had a good second year in the league. Jerry Jeudy obviously didn't really pan out, or hasn't given us that. And I know he was good last year at the end of the season, but like, hasn't given us like what we expected out of him, from a prospecting standpoint. But, CD Lamb's there, where Lamb didn't have this monster. He was looked at really favorably as a prospect, didn't have this like monster rookie year, but obviously it's worked out for him. The problem I have with Marvin Harrison is that I would love to buy into him. I just think it's all kind of priced into him right now. It's same deal with Rome Odunze. Like, Rome Odunze, I mean, I'll tell you what, man, he matches up so well with what we saw to DeAndre Hopkins after DeAndre Hopkins' rookie season, that it's very easy to buy into. I'm talking like every metric lines up, including the fact that he played with DeAndre Hopkins played with Andre Johnson, and then Odunze playing with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. Like, there's a lot to like, but the problem is with both of these guys, I think the market is kind of just like right about them. Like, I'm not buying or selling. I'm just kind of like, yeah, this makes sense where they're being drafted and how people are viewing them. So I'm not like bullish or bearish on either of them. So I don't have like a fun answer, but that's at least some context as to like where the model has them and how the model's viewing them.
Is there a day two guy that you think the market is just wrong on at this time?
I'd probably say, I mean, in
terms of dynasty, of course, since that's where people can now go make that acquisition.
Yeah, I think that probably there's two guys that I think are at least like interesting as like dart throw low cost guys, right? Because you get I categorize all these players based on their scores in these different categories, and there's a flex play category. So the elite producers, you get the four wide receivers I mentioned, Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey, Marvin Harrison, and then the weekly starter you get Rome Odunze and Xavier Worthy, and then you get into the flex play category, which is like, the Keon Colemans of the world, the Ricky Pearsalls, the Xavier Legette's, where it can go in like so many different directions. Like, that's when you start to get like really, there's a lot of variability in these guys' outlooks. But after that is the bench warmer category. And there's two guys who were really surprising to me, ranked where they did. One of them in particular, but the first one is the not as surprising one. Jalen Coker, I think, is just undervalued in a lot of spots, where like you not only have someone whose top journey comparable was Jacoby Myers and Allen Hurns, which sounds bad, but Myers obviously has had a great career, and an underrated one. And Allen Hurns, man, his second year in the league, he was great. He had 105 targets, 1,000 yards. We'll take that all day for Jalen Coker, right? The other thing with Coker is that he played both inside out, and even when Adam Thielen returned and Thielen was playing more in the slot, Coker's yards per route run in the split with Thielen was still pretty strong. He didn't take that much of a hit with and without Thielen. And obviously you can look at him straight up against another rookie in Xavier Legette in the exact same offense. He was way better than Legette on a per route run basis. So I think Coker's really interesting. And then the one that I cannot believe I'm even saying is Devon Vele.
I can't believe you mentioned that name either.
I know. I can't believe it, but like, I'm trying to, this is one of those situations where like, no, we should not be expecting the world. We should not be expecting like crazy output from a dude who was 26 years old entering the NFL.
That's the part that's hard.
Yeah, right. But think of it this way. What if the Broncos don't go out and invest super heavily at wide receiver after Sean Payton, talking to Kay Adams back in February, talked about how, he has the joker role in his offense, and it's usually a tight end or a running back that he uses in that role, whether it's Darren Sproles, Alvin Kamara, Jimmy Graham. He wants to find that joker. He's going to find that joker this offseason. Maybe it's Evan Ingram. I have no idea. But he's trying to find that dude. But when Kay Adams pressed him about getting like a true alpha on that team, opposite of like a Cortland Sutton, he said that he basically said that he liked Like his quote was, "I would say we're stronger there than some would think," when referencing the wide receiver room. So think about a scenario where Devon Vele, who plays slot for them, what if they do get a perimeter guy and he's still the slot, but Devon Vele is a slot in this like kind of up and coming offense, interesting offense. It's not hard to imagine him getting you some production, like a, wide receiver 4 type season, which we would take all day because no one cares about Devon Vele, So that's more of like the dart throw, just gain a little equity. I don't think the ceiling is going to be crazy, but I was just surprised that his year 2 score, looked as not great, but like as decent as it did.
And if you trade for Jalen Coker, don't be surprised if you start telling all your friends about your business ideas and changing the song on the stereo every 10 seconds. We talked for an hour, and yet we didn't scratch the surface. So tell everyone where they can find all of this information in the late round prospect guide.
Yeah, man, all at lateround.com. You go there, you can see my ugly mug, and then click guides, and then you can purchase the guide and get it right away. And then I'll update things the Saturday, the last day of the draft. You will get the updated version of the guide that night, and there will be updated blurbs for all relevant prospects.
And that ugly mug will include your glasses soon. You're going to update the site too.
Yeah, I got to add the glasses eventually.
All right, brother. Well, I appreciate you coming on. And for everyone listening, we will be back next week beginning with our own prospect rankings and discussions, beginning with quarterbacks with Underdog Zone Hayden Wink. So until then, remember, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.